Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We meet in the shadow of the COP26 conference, and as attendees, both of our distinguished conversants may offer us their insights on the outcome of that distinguished gathering. But in the official COP program document, the minister in charge of the conference wrote, "The COVID-19 pandemic has brought devastation to millions around the world, disrupting many parts of the global economy. But climate change has continued, and it ultimately threatens all life on Earth." The last intergovernmental panel on climate change report that I looked at, published in the summer, goes to town in describing the threat and refers to the intensification of the impacts we are witnessing now. Droughts, wildfires, record downpours and temperatures, melting ice, the extinction of species, the undoing of the last many decades of poverty relief, a devastation of the global poor, and interconnected in our vulnerability, severe suffering by the global rich. People of faith make up over 80% of our world's population. Our religions teach us to care for the earth and each other, but how practically might faith leaders find the courage to contribute to the flourishing of our planet at this time? How can faith teachings and communities help us all to make meaningful behavioral changes for the sake of the planet? How do we deal with the theology of climate denial? And in what ways does faith matter to faith communities anyway? To address these and other vital questions, I'm delighted to be joined by two blessings in the faith and environmental field. Their biographies only capture a fraction of what makes them remarkable people. So if I may, I'd like to present here just a few details about them that I find particularly meaningful. Rabbi Wittenberg is no stranger to Limmud audiences, a veteran, authoritative, humble, articulate, gracious, and spiritual presence in the public square. I can think of no greater champion of human dignity and upliftment. He is senior rabbi of the Assembly of Masorti Synagogues UK, a co-president of the Council of Christians and Jews, and a member of the Council of Imams and Rabbis. A voice of conscience on BBC Radio 4's Pause for Thought, an author of multiple works on deep subjects such as bereavement, religious law and theology, etc. I also note that he has penned a book called Things My Dog Has Taught Me About Being a Better Human. A co-founder of EcoSynagogue, he is passionate about the environment and the responsibility of faith leadership and communities in this regard. And it is no secret that this is the area in which he wishes to focus in the future. Karenna Gore is the director of the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary, where her focus is on what she says is the deep mindset that explains how and why we find ourselves in the current climate crisis. She also talks about the changes we need to make in public consciousness in order to create a new value system based on the long-term well-being of all people on the planet. She is the author of an incredibly well-researched and well-written book that she penned as a young person, Lighting the Way, 9 Women Who Changed Modern America, that chronicles the lives of heroines, but fascinatingly, ones who were signs of contradiction in their era and were ahead of their times on such issues as civil and equal rights, public health and environmental protection, and indeed were ridiculed and persecuted as a result. In her book and in her subsequent appearances in the media, she seems to give dignity to dissent and disruption and such matters as the theological roots of the climate crisis, understanding the environmental consequences of the rise of Western industrialization and the concomitant fall of indigenous civilizations, and seeing the propensity of evil to masquerade as good in our polities. In all this, I'm pretty sure that both Jonathan and Karenna, and they've given me permission, I hope, to dispense with formal titles, are ahead of their time too. I'm Krish Raval, by the way. I am the Director of Faith in Leadership, Britain's main leadership development program for lay and clerical personnel. So with that, Jonathan, if I can start with you, are you wanting faith leaders to go and their communities to go beyond their places of worship and become environmental activists? If so, in what ways?
So I think the short answer to that is yes. And attending COP26 really brought that to the fore, because although I've been involved not as long as you or as deeply as you, Karenna, but I've been involved in climate activism for many years, the COP shook me. Just the urgency of it, the ways, listening to voices from the global south, hearing how people were really suffering, said to me, we need to work on ourselves, our homes, our faith communities on every level, but we also need, as faith leaders, to exercise collective moral influence on those who hold political and economic power in our societies. That seems to me an ancient role of faith. If one goes back to the prophetic tradition of trying to tell truth to power, many of the people who did so paid with their lives or with suffering. Nevertheless, it strikes me as a duty. Now, that doesn't mean taking partisan and party political stances. It doesn't necessarily mean causing disruption to society, but it does mean being out there, using one's voice and one's influence in every legitimate way one can, while opening that up also to critique and to comment, so that one does it in the best way possible, and also alongside other faiths, because the voices of different faiths and philosophies together, I think, are multiplied in their strength. So yes.
Thank you. And Karenna, would you go along with that? Would you concur, or in what ways do you concur?
Well, let me say, first of all, thank you so much for your warm words of welcome. I'm so honored to be in this conversation. Thank you, Rabbi Wittenberg, for giving me the opportunity to be talking with you and to be a part of this wonderful Limmud gathering, which I have such respect for. And I am really struck by the need in this time to draw deeply from our faith and wisdom traditions in the world, what we are dealing with the climate crisis, the climate emergency. Words fail us clearly to actually describe these circumstances. But what we're dealing with is about so much more than data and science and technology, as important as those things may be. This is about our perception of why we are here as human beings in this life in the first place. What are our moral obligations to one another across space, across time, even across species? We have these concurrent crises of climate, which we are all at this point familiar with what we mean by that, a crisis that is caused by two mega trends of the greenhouse gas pollutions we're putting in this thin shell of atmosphere around the planet since the Industrial Revolution, from the burning of oil, coal, and gas, and also the depletion of the carbon sinks, such as forests and wetlands. So those two modern megatrends are what we're dealing with in terms of the climate crisis. We also, of course, have human health crisis around the world, which is caused in part by pollution, in part by the inequities and the toxicity of things like food systems, the way that we've organized feed which of course we have hunger, but we also have now for the first time obesity and diet-related problems as major causes of suffering among peoples around the world as a result of that. So So the climate crisis, the human health crisis, and then the biodiversity crisis, the loss of species around the world. And when you look at these things in tandem, it does seem as if it's almost snuck up on us that the very things that we have sometimes thought are causing progress are actually the things that are hurting us the most. And this is a very difficult challenge to unravel. It takes a capacity to think metaphysically, actually, about time, about place, about being. And it also takes the ability to motivate people. And that means appealing to our deepest sense of values. And so I believe truly that the world's faith and religious and spiritual traditions are the best equipped, really, to deal with this stage of the problem. We have the information that we need. We largely have the technologies that we need. What we don't have is an ability to collectively shift perception and change behavior. And so I think that in Glasgow at the COP, it was very striking to see how many people were. We have to celebrate the range, the breadth of people who agree, in at least on. In terms of the words, the vocabulary about that this is a crisis, about that we must act, and yet we have to look clearly at the dissonance between that and what's actually being done, and we need to understand that it's not simple, it's not easy, it's not a matter just of pointing fingers and blame, but it is about unraveling some of these systems. And I really truly believe that the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, that the wisdom within Judaism, just to highlight this, given the conversation that I'm blessed to be in, are absolutely critical. And so I look forward to hearing more of that wisdom. And thank you so much for allowing me to be with you.
Thanks, Karenna. And may I just say that, I look forward to the two of you engaging with each other without me in this discussion too, so you can ask each other questions. But just to kind of prompt some further thoughts. If faith leaders were loyal to their source material, the teachings of their source texts, some would say that the environmental crisis would never have happened. The 20th century fallacy that nature has conquered, we have conquered nature rather, or nature is conquerable, would not have existed. So if faith leaders and faith communities as a whole wanted to challenge and wanted to curb environmental degradation, they would have done so. We wouldn't be in the situation we're in. And I note what you say, Karenna, that we don't want to blame. But do you think that as a faith leader, Rabbi Wittenberg, do you think faith communities have a responsibility for the state that we're in? Because I've heard you speak rather animatedly about this.
Thank you, Krish, and also thank you, Karenna. And I didn't acknowledge how appreciative I am of you both and your inspiration and the opportunity for this conversation. So there's a Jewish joke, thank you, God, for giving us the Torah. Now let us tell you what it means. And so much hinges upon interpretation. And there's been, I think, a misunderstanding of the opening chapter of Genesis, which is something I think one finds it in the Judeo-Christian tradition. I'm very familiar with Jewish texts that curb it and counter it. But it's this notion of domination and the notion of the anthropocentrism of creation, that everything is created in the first 5.5 days, but the human being will be able to subjugate and dominate them all, and that has allowed a sense of separation between the human and the rest of creation, which I think is counter-indicated by so much else in the Hebrew Bible and in Jewish and Christian thought. Yet there it is, and that has allowed itself to become allied to I would even say second half of the 20th century onwards, rampant consumerism. Mm-hmm. And what Naomi Klein has called not just capitalism, she hasn't blamed capitalism, she said unbridled capitalism, which has taken us away from a profound sense of stewardship and responsibility, which is the overwhelming ethic towards the earth of the Hebrew Bible. It's the second chapter of Genesis, that God puts the human being in the garden, which is a kind of metonym for the world, to work it with reverence and to keep it in the same way as one keeps or looks after that which belongs to someone else, i.e. other human beings, the future, our children, and indeed God. So faiths have a responsibility for where we've taken misdirections, for sure, and a responsibility towards being faithful for our own towards our own tradition. At the same time, I have to say that particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, I find myself embedded, and often willingly so, in a culture which is similar across the North and the Western world, which I find myself more and more at odds with morally, and more want to say, I don't really want to be part of this. Mm-hmm. And I'm questioning, do I need what I'm told I need? Do I need to go to the places which, are available? And just because I can, does it mean that I may or should? So on that level, we haven't been faithful and courageous enough to the commandments of our faith. But there's something else as well, which I find very, and Karenna, I don't know how you'd respond to this from the point of view of Christian mystical tradition. They're the commandments about caring for the environment, for animal life, for the earth. It's a sabbatical year, which means we have to leave it fallow and share it. But there's something else as well, which is in the mystical tradition. God's revelation is through and within nature. The 10 utterances of creation are ongoing, so that when God says, let us make earth or separate water from land, this is there now. And in the very elements and in all life is the sacred presence of the divine. So destroy it, and I'm destroying something sacred and absolutely important, of which I am absolutely a part. Mm-hmm. And the thought of that actually is close to unbearable. Mm-hmm. And I realize that I'm a participant in something which I think is really wrong.
Karenna,
yes.
You were invited to respond to on the basis of the mystical traditions, if you wanted to.
Yes, well, if I may, I want to respond to a couple of things, and that connects deeply to how I feel as well, Rabbi Wittenberg. The sense of
please, Jonathan is fine.
Oh, Jonathan. So that I don't. How do we feel? So in Laudato Si, in Pope Francis's encyclical on care for our common home, he talks about the need for us all to become painfully aware, and that is, I think, it's how many of us have experienced it. It is so, the awareness is so painful because of our complicity, because of our participation, and it is part of the problem with doing ethics in this whole circumstance, because many people will withdraw from even attempting it because they think, well, I'm participating in it, and so who am I to say? And yet, if that's the reigning ethos, we all go down with this. And so we must reject that. And there are so many passages in the Bible alone that address that. How does one deal with hypocrisy or, participation in systems that to be immoral? And the call, as far as I have read, is always to do the difficult thing of withdrawing, of speaking the truth of it. That is an eternal verity of life, that one will find these occasions, and when the way you make your choice. is part of defining your life path. However, of course, there are things on the other side. We want to show love to each other. We want to participate in cultures. We want to give and receive gifts. We want to say thank you for when we're given food, or participate if you're thirsty and someone gives you a plastic bottle of water. It's difficult to constantly be rejecting the things of our society because we feel as if we're rejecting the love and the participation that's coming from people. So this is why in faith communities we have to look at it systemically, and not just as a matter of individual choice. And I think that that's very important. To go back very briefly to what you said about the book of Genesis and dominion, I just want to say that this is a thread that I find to be very important and powerful. And there was an essay written in 1967 called "The Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis." Actually, I think he called it "The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis," by Lynn White, who was a medieval historian. And he made this point that about Christianity. So you mentioned Judeo-Christian tradition. I know that term can be controversial among some. We don't want to be in any way ever super sessionary about Judaism lives on its own, the Hebrew Bible. We understand that, but the interpretation of those terms and concepts in the book of Genesis through Christianity, and particularly through the partnership of Christianity and colonization, is, I think, where we have run into a lot of trouble, because it becomes amplified through the force of colonization. And in Lynn White's essay, he was talking about actually Europe. So he was talking about the victory. He said the biggest psychic revolution in the history of humankind was the victory of Christianity over paganism in Europe. And what he was talking about was that when there was sacred, when rivers and forests were seen as sacred, it was harder to pollute them or chop them down, because it was seen that they had living spirits, and that this was. But when there was a theological shift driven by economic interest to say, no, that's not what's sacred. What's sacred is what we tell you is sacred, which is what the priest will bless in the wafer, and that's that. I mean, I'm being very, broad brushstrokes here, but the point is that his thesis was that this was what made the change. Now, it's a controversial thesis, mainly though because, and I have the critiques that I've read, I think mainly are pointing out that that's not the essence of Christianity. Look at all of these teachings within Christianity. Look at all these teachings from the Bible, and but the point is the interpretation, the way that people lived it, the way that it was put out there. I think actually there is some truth to it, and the reason why I feel like there's so much truth to it is because my path included encounters way further down the line in time with Native American peoples living out west in the United States. It's only a matter of 100 years or so, and even it's currently happening, whereby they're told the same thing, that your sacred natural site that you feel is sacred, that's paganism, that's devil worship, that's not actually genuine, that's not religion, that can't be seen as sacred. And so ceremonies, sweat lodge ceremonies, seeing a sacred natural site is not respected, in part because of this interpretation that came from what Lynn White calls the victory of Christianity over paganism. So it's a very complicated subject, but I just want to draw the line because it goes through what happened in Europe, but then the papal bulls that came from the Vatican in the mid 15th century. And I know I'm speaking to you all I'm in the United States of America. My life has been in the political life of the United States of America. So I'm very for us here, this notion of that there is, it's very much in the background that there's a kind of divine ordination of the presence of European descended people in this land, because that's what happened when the age of exploration launched the European colonization. It was in tandem with Christianity. There were crosses planted by Christopher Columbus and on down the line, and then the concept of manifest destiny came. So that I do think that that going back to the book of Genesis and looking at the original meaning of what is dominion, to go back into the Bible and to read those texts without what has and clarify is actually very powerful. Now, to the Christian mysticism point, I think that it's absolutely the case that there are ways of understanding divine revelation within the natural world that make it clear that to destroy this beautiful web of life is absolutely antithetical to being in alignment with the divine and the sacred, because this is created not of man. We have a society in which, people are selling water, people are selling, there's very little. The art culture has done everything possible to make it seem as if the things that we rely on for our sustenance are somehow given to us by stores, and not from the earth. And in fact, what indigenous peoples, which has been a major place of teaching and learning and perception shifting for me, talk about is to go back to the original instructions. That the original instructions are to see that we care for water. Water is given by Mother Earth, and we are born of this. We are made of water. We are made of air, iron in our blood. We have all of these. We are not in any ways separate. And so I believe that the conversation about the mystical Christianity is also quite deep theologically, because there are elements of what we've alluded to as dualism, the separation of spirit and matter, which is a very, it's a complicated theological discussion, which I'd love to hear more from you about how you feel about that. There's a strain of Gnosticism that actually does really honor that there is something separate about the soul that is not totally of this material world. And yet there are many, many teachings, like, for example, St. Catherine of Siena says the soul and God, it's like the fish and the sea. The fish is in the sea and the sea is in the fish. And so we need to be able to understand the ways in which we are so much a part of this earth spiritually and physically, that our care for it is part of our path. If we see it as a spirit, as spiritual ascent, that's part of the path that's been given to us, as well as, of course, to care for others. So I'm sorry to go on for so long, but that very subject pushed all my buttons at once. So thank you.
Fascinating. Jonathan, I mean, you'll want to respond to that and see if there are, if you respond to the mysticism point. But very bluntly, I mean, you're not suggesting that we go back and kind of go into I don't know what, I don't want to put it crudely, so I'm hesitating with words, but are we going to eschew technology and all the gifts that technology has given us? Because that's what's going to be in people's minds. That, are you suggesting that we go back to medieval times and kind of live in sort of Luddite conditions? That's not what you're suggesting.
Is this for me to try to respond to?
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that's.
I'm asking you to respond to both things. The point on, I think, the mystical traditions are, with all our distinctiveness, the different faith communities can really meet in the mystical traditions. There's something there that you can converge on, and I wondered whether you wanted to comment on that. But also this point that is in the back of people's minds, that all these people who want environmental change really want us to go back to some pre-antediluvian times or something like that, want us to live in that way. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I had thought of acquiring a donkey and going to synagogue on weekdays, but
please do.
I haven't embraced the idea.
Yeah, we'll go to town. Yeah.
Just several things I want to respond to, because there's so much in what you've said now and what Karenna, what you said. I just want to touch on the link with colonization, because I spent some of my summer reading a Black and British A Forgotten History, which I found shocking and moving. And I think there's a profound link actually with the slave trade here, which is we were able to commodify human life, and we try to step back from doing that. At least formally we have as nations. Informally, there's a huge slave trade around the world, but formally we haven't stepped back from commodifying and monetizing the things that make lives possible in other parts of the world. So that one of the things I'm aware when I go to the supermarket is I simply don't know what, by buying product X, I am doing to people in a place I cannot see, but I can be pretty sure that the things that make their life potentially wealthier, and I'm not just thinking financially, but in terms of natural resources, in terms of quality of life, in terms of payment for their labor, in terms of the use of finite material resources, I am taking more than my share by doing that. And that seems to me legitimized by a kind of economics, which, while doesn't sell human beings and ship them through the middle passage, does something rather similar with the things that make their lives possible. And this really worries me. So different to sort of, I mean, that's a strong moral argument against the reach of consumerism that seems to me to dominate so much of our society. In terms of the mystical tradition, I wonder, and this is not something usually said, a lot of the Hebrew Bible is a polemic against idolatry and abominations which we would regard as abominations, such as child sacrifice. But I wonder whether the notion of sacred place, which you find in the hilltops and shrines, didn't encapsulate some awareness of the sacred within nature that was lost and largely reinstated by the Gnostic tradition fulfilled in Judaism, which leads in Judaism into the Kabbalistic tradition, which does see the immanence of God not within the material world, while preserving a sense of the unknowable transcendence of the divine, both of which are present in the human being. And that awareness has the capacity to enable or enjoin an intrinsic respect for all of nature and all its products, which I think are purely sort of something sort of, it's an added dimension to a purely moral ethics here, and so is important. Do I think we should go back to medieval times? I think that if we don't do something urgent and significant about the climate crisis, we will be back in medieval times, because it's not just that the world will get hotter, it's that every kind of resource will get less, and we'll finish up with fighting each other in areas of the world we've thought safe for generations. So no, I think I often focus on Naomi Klein's word unbridled capitalism, the notion that we have to rethink our consumerism, rethink our responsibilities, rethink the notion of climate and global justice radically, but not in such a way that that we abandon all forms of technology always. What that needs to look like, I think the world of technology and the world of economics, in some respects, ahead of the world of politics in trying to think that through.
Karenna, would you respond to that? I mean,
yeah.
About the care economy, universal basic income, the idea that we value, nature as opposed to man-made tokens called money. Your institute looked at that.
Yes. Well, I really appreciate what you just said, Jonathan. I was thinking about idolatry, and it's true that when people, when I spoke about the Lynn White thesis and this idea of paganism, and some people, that itself is a contested and complex topic. What is paganism? I think that there is a fear that people have of this idea of worshiping nature, that we're, that somehow this is idolatry, or this is misplaced from God. And you see that in terms of secular discourse. I mean, we have this sort of white Christian nationalism strain in the US, which I alluded to before, which sort of in a culture war pits itself against the idea of sort of tree hugging people, right? And it becomes a kind of article of faith to not go there. And I think that in fact, what you're pointing to is idolatry more in the sense of golden calf, idolatry in the sense of the things that are actually man-made totems of meaning that are actually much more aligned with what we have done in our society, which is seen as secular. But how does idolatry manifest today? I mean, there are people who, Ralph Waldo Emerson is one of the thinkers that has said, people worship something. Even if you say you don't, in the recesses of your heart, there is something that you cherish. I'm not getting the quote exactly, but we can look it up. And so be careful what you worship, because what you worship, you are becoming. And I think that when we look at our society en masse that thinks that considers itself secular, in fact, there is a worship that's become almost an idolatry. And you can say that it's money, that it's economic growth. I absolutely, or that it's unbridled capitalism, as you've said. I absolutely think that those things are the circumstance that we find ourselves in. It's not adequate to discuss without the epic meaning of a word like idolatry. That we're dealing with. In fact, what we are sacrificing is so huge. It's the lives of all future generations, of our own families, all of us, and we know it. It's absolutely astounding that still there is this value system that and this goes back. So economic growth is lifted up constantly as the sort of paramount. Here's where we get to a term that you alluded to earlier, Krish. I find this theological term to be useful, of structural evil. So Cynthia Mola-Beta is a theologian who wrote a whole book on structural evil. And she goes back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was at Union Theological Seminary briefly, where my center is based, and was executed by the Nazis for his part going back to attempt to oppose the Nazi regime. So she says that one of the key characteristics of structural evil is that it easily masquerades as good. So when we have, for example, economic growth, or the metric of GDP, and forgive me if everybody's heard this a million times, often I am sometimes told that, oh, we all know that GDP is inadequate. But why are we still using it then? Why do we still talk about it all the time as the measure of a successful society? So GDP does not count pollution, depletion. Those are the two megatrends causing climate change. It doesn't account inequality of outcome. So GDP goes up, but it's only in the hands of a few. And it doesn't count positive long-term investments in things like childcare and healthcare. And yet it has been basically codified through the Bretton Woods negotiations, through the economic, financial institutions, the monetary institutions, and so on, that this is what we use to measure. So no wonder we allow for this system that is depleting things at much faster rate than they can be replenished, because we're not even counting them when we think about success. And I think that it's important to go back and to talk about that in terms of as you say, idolatry. And there was one other thing that you lifted up when you said, what was it? You said that the Hebrew Bible is largely, it talks about idolatry, and you said one other thing.
Not sure.
Okay.
Sacred spaces. I'm sorry, we do have to. We've only got 7 minutes left.
Oh, sorry.
And I know, hasn't it gone quickly, this conversation? Yeah. Perhaps we'll do it again. But I wanted to end with, well, firstly saying thank you for the privilege of hosting you. I feel like a star-eyed kid looking at your perspectives and trying to digest them. But I want you to end, if I may, with a recommendation. What should be the thing, or I mean, I don't want to say one thing, but what's the practical thing or things that faith communities, our faith communities, should be doing? So if you're, if somebody's listening to this conversation, if you were going to tell them one thing, or one set of things that they should do, what should it be? And Karenna, might I start with you before moving to Jonathan? So please, Karenna.
Well, I want to be brief. I like to think of the three roles of faith communities in this ecological crisis as the prophetic, the pastoral, and the practical. So I do think prophetic is important, to tell the truth, to talk about this issue, to give sermons and talks, to go back and bring the teachings to light. And a pastoral, to help people overcome their reticence to think about it, because of grief, because of anxiety, because of guilt, all those things. And then practically, of course, we can try to disentangle ourselves from the fossil fuel economy by divestment, by switching to clean renewable energies. People are often don't try to not focus on fossil fuels because of what we've already discussed, the complicity we all have and so on. But I think that practically to make moves so that we can get, because ultimately that's the goal of the COPs, is by the end of this century, we should have zero emissions. We should not be doing this anymore. So that means that practically we all have to do our part to get there.
Thank you, Karenna. Jonathan?
So I appreciate all of the things that you've just said. And I sometimes feel we have to work at every level. We have to work in our own personal lives and our own homes at that divestment and that moving from a fossil fuel economy and that rethinking the degree of our consumerism. And we have to take that into our synagogues, churches, mosques, temples, into our communities. And then we also have to take that into our wider society and find partnerships and alliances and lobby and use the maximum of influence in any way we can. And that, I guess, is the prophetic tradition piece. But I wanted to say something else which went through my mind here as well, which is when one goes to a cemetery, and I know Jewish cemeteries much better than others, you very rarely see a sign saying so-and-so earned such and such and achieved such and such. You see things like the quote from Micah, "Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God." And what we're not good at in Western societies is thinking about what we're doing with our consciousness and what we're doing to our neighbor and for our neighbor. And I think refocusing, how am I using my consciousness in life? What actually matters to me to be? And what am I contributing to my neighbor, by which I include the trees and the animals and the people? Those two questions need to be our sort of foremost spiritual and moral questions. And they validate our existence in the way that external things just don't. And that's why they're there in the cemeteries. So I think there's that inner spiritual work, and there's the work on every level in the practical world as well.
Thank you very much. I think we can leave it there. It's been a real privilege being in this room with you and this conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Krish. Thank you, Karenna. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Krish. Thank you, Jonathan. My pleasure.